If you're here to talk, I'm gonna ask you respectfully, you can go to the back, just so we're not interrupted. Adults, if you're here to talk, I'm gonna say if you need to talk, please feel free to exit outside or go to the gym area so that we can actually convene in the discussion, because a lot of the chatter actually is very hard then to talk to you all and actually teach you and to go through this program, inshallah. And even for the kiddos, I know it's hard, but inshallah I'm going to ask the parents, if you have younger kids, to keep them with you, inshallah, okay? Just to make it easier for everybody. Does that sound like a plan? Yeah, we're good? Okay, alhamdulillah. So we are continuing our discussions in the life of the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A quick recap, we discussed feedback. Any of the volunteers here? Check. If any of the volunteers are here, can we get the front mic? Check. That's better.
Make sure the mics are off. Turn them up.
Check. Okay, let's try that again. So alhamdulillah, we are going through the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Last week, so for the last few weeks, what we've been talking about is the preparation for the Battle of Badr. Last week, we still just started talking about as the night came upon the night of Badr. And today, inshallah, we're going to talk about the actual morning, how the actual battle unfolded, inshallah, and what happens at the end of the battle. Let's see how much time we have and what we're able to get through. A quick recap, like I said, we were talking about how much of the army, we had the Quraysh's army of 1,300, along with their horses, their cavalry, everything ready for war. Whereas the Muslims, they only had what? How many people was it? 3,013? 313, right? Compared to the 1,300 of the Quraysh's army. Were the Muslims prepared for war? No, right? But the Quraysh's army, were they prepared for war? Yes, they were. And so we talked about how the Quraysh and the Muslims, they led up and they started coming towards the area of Badr. We talked about how amongst the Quraysh and many of the leaders in Quraysh, although they had many people, 1,300, what you found amongst them, the leaders of them, was that they weren't really enthusiastic about going to war. They really didn't want to go and fight the Muslims. They didn't want to go to war. They felt as if this was going to be against them, even though they had so many people, even though they had the power, they had the numbers, but many of the leaders amongst them, they weren't happy with the idea of going to Badr and fight the Muslims. We talked about how the Muslims set up their camps. We talked about the night before Badr. And then we talked a little bit about the war strategy. Inshallah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. Now, we left off last week talking about how the Prophet ﷺ was at the night, right? The Prophet ﷺ was setting up his army and he was devising his war strategy for the battle ahead. And we said that they had introduced, or the Prophet ﷺ had introduced a new strategy. What was the new strategy? Does anybody remember? Yeah. Say that again. Yeah, but the war strategy, you're right. They did break the wells, that's for you. You're right. But what did they do? What was different regarding how they formed their strategy? Yeah. Row by row, right? Which was different than what? What was the normal way? Yep. Attract and retreat, what does that mean? The whole army, right? All of them would go forward and then they would come back. All of them would go forward and come back. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ put rows. The first row they had these people with spears. The second row was those who had archery, basically the ones who were shooting the arrows. And then the third row was the ones with horses, right? And the few horses that they had and the ones with swords. And so this is how the Prophet ﷺ had devised the strategy for war at night with the companions. Now, we said that the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslims were blessed with two things at night. What were they blessed with? Rain, give me one. Rain, you're right. And what was the other? No speaking up? Yep. Sleep. So this was the two things. Ali radiallahu anhu, he narrates that the Prophet ﷺ, that at night, when he was going around, he noticed that all of the companions were asleep, except he narrates that the Prophet ﷺ, he was up. And what was the Prophet ﷺ doing at night, the night of Badr? Yeah. He was praying, right? He was making dua to Allah to give success and victory to the believers. Now, the Prophet ﷺ eventually slept for a little